Awesome. Well, it's good to see everybody. It has definitely been a while. I know it's going to take a little bit of time to get used to the new format, but I think it's a good option while we're to get us going forward again. First order of business today is going to be minutes for approval. Does anyone have any comments, questions, or edits to the minutes? And just as a note, those are from March 5th. That was our last meeting. All right, so just to preface the voting here, we had talked about in that online or the test session, we're going to do voting by show of hands, and then we'll make sure that we have a tally of those. We're going to do motions and seconds also by show of hands, and I will identify who made the motion or the second. So do we have a motion to approve the minutes from our March 5th meeting? All right, got Mark Sr. Is there a second? Ken, there's a second from Ken. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, approved unanimously. Wayne, I'm trying to watch all the squares, and I don't have just the commission members, so I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but it might take me a minute to get used to.
No, working great. I'll let me know if you need help identifying anyone or any vote.
I'm sure I can use a little help keeping track of that. So if you are able, that'd be good. But anyway, Wayne, go ahead with staff updates and other hot topics from the department.
Sure, great. Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate it. City of Raleigh Stormwater staff have been very busy through the pandemic period. I can't say anything has slowed down. In fact, in some ways, things have been more busy. We are, for the most part, working at home where possible. Our construction projects are ongoing, and so our field inspectors have been continuing to monitor that progress in the field. Construction work, supplies have continued to move forward on track. So I can't say I can identify any specific slowdowns associated with the pandemic or economic conditions. So that's very good news. Our development inspectors, erosion, sedimentation control inspectors are also working in the field, and that work continues as well. More recently, we have added field work where we are doing drainage investigations again. That work had stopped for a couple of months at least, actually probably more like 3 months, but we have recently added that field assignment. And again, everyone's wearing masks, using PPE, social distancing while in the field appropriately. So we are taking all precautions as possible to keep our employees as well as citizens safe. We've also recently started our inspections of stormwater control measures, private stormwater control measures. So that work is continuing. But for the most part, staff are working remotely as possible. Work continues. And we've all quickly become experts at virtual meetings. And, I do believe, as I'm sure many of you are finding out, I think we're finding some best practices that we will continue to use even post-pandemic in terms of how we're conducting business and working productively. So overall, very good news. Council, recently, if some of you may have watched at the council meeting this past Tuesday, the council did pass a rate increase of 50 cents per single family equivalent unit per month. So do appreciate all the input and support you all have given us. As an update of the progression, since you all endorsed the level 3, which was the highest level of service in a $3 increase. That was pre-pandemic. Seems like ages ago now. After the pandemic hit, our budget workshop sessions several were canceled with council. So it was a very different budget preparation process this year. So working with the city manager's office, we prepared a revised budget. And actually, in terms of the final recommendation, staff did present to council and recommend, because of the economic conditions, that no rate increase be given this year. In response to that, council asked about the options, the level of service options that SMAC had considered, and asked for us to come back and make a presentation specifically on more details of those options, which we did. At that point in time, SMAC endorsed a willingness to give a modest rate increase of 50 cents. Because of the difference in the rate process this year, that presentation was after the official budget public hearing had been held. So in order to approve a rate increase and be consistent with state law, we had to hold another public hearing specifically for the stormwater rate increase. So that was what we had here recently on July 7th. That was the stormwater only public hearing. There were no public comments received, but council then did, after that public hearing, take the official vote, and it was a unanimous vote to support the 50-cent rate increase. So so we're very pleased with that, and weren't expecting that, but very, very pleased, and we will certainly do our best to use that money wisely. Staff is proposing that 50-cent rate increase, because of the timing of how it was done, it won't take place until September 1st. So there is a slight delay, but as of September 1st, we'll be able to start collecting those increased fees. That would produce about $1.7 million in FY21, which staff is proposing to use solely on capital improvements projects and accelerate some neighborhood flooding related projects that otherwise, without a rate increase, would have had to be deferred. So that's our staff proposal for the rate increase this year. Any questions on either of those items? Comments?
Wayne, I just want to say thanks for sticking with the budget issues sort of as things got a little bit sort of different in terms of schedule and budget meetings. I think that's good news that you guys did get a 50% increase, or excuse me, a 50 cents increase in the fee. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks for your support, Jonathan, at the workshop as well.
I was surprised and pleased to see the council provided that increase given the COVID environment, because most people are not. I mean, they're all just holding the line. So it's a great thing.
Agreed. Okay, with that then, we have two more brief items I'd like to give an update, but the next one, the update on the floodplain regulations, I'd like to pass that to Ben Brown. Let Ben give a brief update on where that stands. Ben?
All right. This has been wanted to give you guys just a quick update. Staff is working to get the floodplain text change back to council. Council had asked for some of the economic impacts and also to look at our outreach strategy in a little more detail as far as for the text the text change. So we are preparing that. That was scheduled to kind of come either May or June, but with the COVID issues got kind of pushed back a couple months. So right now we're on track to go back to council, their first meeting in September, unless something changes else on their calendar or in the global calendar. We are meeting with the attorneys to kind of go over the language of the actual tech changes. Tomorrow we're going to kick that off, and we are working on the economic numbers, and we will have the outreach stuff ready to go to council by their September meeting. So, or their first September meeting. So that's pretty much the high level update. If you guys have any specific questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Great, thank you, Penn. And then
Thanks, Ben.
if there's no questions on that, staff, we have one other brief update we'd like to provide on the green stormwater infrastructure plan and policy, and I'll turn it over to Kevin Boyer to give you a brief update on that.
Thank you, Wayne, and afternoon all. Wayne asked me to touch on 5 GSI projects that are in the works near term. One of them is under construction, nearing completion at the Raleigh Rose Garden. That's 2 bioretention cells to treat runoff from asphalt pavement and part of the roof at the Raleigh Little Theater. Looking real good. Go out and take a look when you have a chance. Plantings to be done in the fall after weather cools down. In addition to that one, we have 4 that are bundled together into one construction contract. We just recently received bids after several delays because of COVID. At long last got good bids. Taking that to City Council on August 18th for approval. That's 4 projects. 2 of them at the Wetland Center, or Wetland Park, Walnut Creek Wetland Park, gravel wetland on Peterson Street. Bioretention along Peterson Street, that's in the right of way in the grass strip. Bioretention in a wedge of unused street right of way at the intersection of Glenwood Avenue and St. Mary's Street, and 2 bioretention cells at Glen Eden Pilot Park at the end of a dead-end street, treating runoff from that street. About our initiative assigned from City Council about advancing the use of GSI. It has been a long time since the GSI committee of the commission met. That was February 18th. During that meeting, and as well as during the commission's meeting on March 5th, SMAC members and staff discussed wrapping up the work on the GSI policy for city development projects, and also taking up work on enhancing incentives for private developers to incorporate GSI into their projects. The commission agreed that the committee should meet again during March, and that was scheduled but was canceled. The staff emailed the items that would have been used at that meeting, that committee meeting, to the committee, and then later on May 1st to the full commission. Ongoing work on the GSI policy could focus on the role of comparing GSI and gray infrastructure lifecycle costs using the city's GSI cost tool, which is wrapping up development by our consultant Tetra Tech. We've heard interest from the commission in seeing cost estimates and comparisons for actual city projects to help refine the policy's wording about costs. And those actual city projects could be something like the planned downtown new civic campus, a fire station, a park facility, road widening. It could be selected for cost comparisons. After we being the commission and through the committee, wrap up work on the GSI policy, we're slated to move into evaluating possible enhancements to incentives for private developers. And we suggest that when we do that, we start in with what incentives we have, how they work, and how well they have worked. But getting to the next GSI committee meeting is something that needs to be discussed. Staff would like to restart meetings of the committee, but that obviously is easier said than done. And given formats and logistics, we'd like to hear your thoughts about when and how to resume that work, whether it's through a committee or some other forum that we haven't thought about. Thanks, Wayne.
Thank you, Kevin. And that's all we had. If anyone has questions for Kevin on the GSI plan, or we'd welcome any feedback if you would like to restart those committee meetings, we would be glad to help facilitate that virtually or however else you all thought would be appropriate. Or if there's any other questions on any of the items, we'd be glad to address those too.
I would just say, I think it would be great to virtually restart those meetings. The environment continues, even though COVID has shut us down. And I think that, you know, granted, there'll be bigger funding issues at play here and other things going on, but I think that being ready for when the doors open back up with a solid plan makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I'm supportive of starting them back up too. If we can do it virtually, that's fine. This format seems to work pretty well.
Very good. We'd be glad to go ahead and do that. And I would suggest, Kevin, you and I can get together. Maybe we'll pick some potential dates and send out a poll as we've done before. Try to get meetings at a time that'll meet for most. I'm sorry, Reverend Taylor?
Yeah. The report, just
Yes,
one comment. When you talk about incentive for private developers, it certainly piqued my interest, particularly given the proposed complex entertainment / sports complex on Walnut Creek, that 100-acre site, and the impact that would have on neighborhood, particularly Rochester Heights and Walnut Creek downstream. So more of a comment that certainly whatever we can do to incentivize projects, particularly that one, because the environmental impact, I think in the negative realm, proves to be high if GSI is not a huge part of that development.
Appreciate your comment. We'll certainly bring that up, make a point of bringing it up when we resume. And thank you for having your eye on that development project.
All right, Wayne, do you have anything else sort of along the lines of updates at this point, or?
No, that's all we have, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Sounds good. All right, we're going to move along to Justin Harkham and the Raleigh Rainwater Rewards Program. Justin, there we go.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Good to see everyone. I think Kelly's going to bring the presentation up. Is that correct, Kelly? There we go. And I'm probably going to be saying slides several times because I'm not in control here. I'm going to jump right into it. I've got a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to start out with the quarterly report for the Rainwater Rewards Program for both new members and reminder to current members. Water Quality Cost Share Program, or what is now known as Rainwater Rewards Program, was approved in 2009. It was created to financially assist property owners in the city of Raleigh with the installation of stormwater SCMs or practices on their property where they are in excess of current stormwater regs to the extent funds are available and to the extent that it's reasonable and practical. And so this is the last quarterly update since, or the latest quarterly update since January. The Wayne had provided an update to the commission members in May, which brought us up to speed till the end of April. And so this covers from the end of April to July 30th, and this is the final fiscal year 20 quarterly update. The next slide, please. Oh, I do have control. I apologize. This is just the portion of the policy that shows where we're required to report on number of projects approved and implemented and funds committed. Next slide, please. And once again, we'll focus on the staff approved projects from April to present, and then projects completed. Completed being installed and starting their required maintenance period. This is usually the point of the presentation where I would hand out giant print off. Unable to do that now, but it has been included in your SMAC agenda and backup documents. As always, it is sorted by project type, and then once again, sorted by cost per pound of nitrogen removed. So the most cost efficient projects are on the top of each category. You'll also note that the city council district for each project has been added per Reverend Taylor's request in January. Next slide, please. Are there any questions with that? Does anyone have any questions with that handout? All right, this is pulled from that handout are the 5 staff approvals since April 30th. They're all small residential staff level approvals, obviously. 3 rain gardens, 2 cisterns. Any questions at this point? All right, next slide, please. We've had 1 project closed out since the end of April. It's a rather large one, 2409 Crabtree. It's the Gateway Plaza project, 7 bioretentions and about an acre of impervious surface removed. Definitely encourage anyone who's traveling the Capitol Boulevard corridor to swing in there and see the enhancements and these functioning stormwater devices. It's a good showcase project. All right, and next slide, please. This is the last slide I have for the quarterly update. It's something new that Kevin and myself have been working on and putting together. It's showing the reimbursement history for the life of the Rainwater Awards program. And really the key takeaway here is just the increase in activity in the last 4 fiscal years. From fiscal year 17 to 20, you have 75 projects of a total 95 for the 10-year period. And that, I just wanted to say that, that's a testament to communication outreach, to positive experiences with the program, and then also staff, commission, and city council support for the program. So any questions about anything I've covered and run through here on quarterly update? All right, next slide, please.
Just a comment supporting you guys in the outreach activity. I think that's great, the amount of increase you guys have had. The program was kind of slow to get going and got it taken off now.
Yeah, hey, Justin, one other question for you. It looked like you mentioned the project that was recently under construction with like 7 bioretention areas or something like that with a total reimbursement of $115,000 or so. Obviously that's a pretty large project in terms of dollar amount for the program. What have some of those other larger projects been? I think I saw one on there for like maybe $290K, and then
that is correct. Our most expensive project to date, I want to say, is St. Andrew's Church, which is a large bioretention that treats about 2 acres of impervious, and that is at $225,000 reimbursement. So that's probably our Raleigh Union Station is also up there in cost. So that's the higher end. And as y'all may not be familiar with now with the new process, the low end can be under $1,000. So we could have a really small patio removal or DIY cistern project that could come in real low. So that it really runs the full spectrum there. So I don't know if that answered your question, Jonathan, or.
Yeah, no, that's good. Do we include signage and that sort of thing on some of those larger commercial projects? Just, it seems like a really good opportunity where more eyes are on it. That sort of thing. So
historically, it has been up to the applicants to include signage in their proposal, and it is usually considered as eligible for reimbursement. So an example of that would be the Church of the Good Shepherd. They're having bioretention installed, and they included signage in their estimate. Some of these other bigger projects, Crabtree Boulevard is an example of this. So is Longleaf Hotel. Staff is actively working with communications to develop some Rainwater Award template signs that we can change some identifying criteria or some information on those templates and use those signs citywide as projects move forward. Pretty much offering them this template to reduce costs so folks will use them. In addition, we're also floating the idea of of smaller yard signs for your smaller residential, maybe front yard, rain gardens type applications, so that there's some sort of identification, both education wise and also tying it back to the program for marketing purposes.
Gotcha. Yeah, that sounds good. I would be curious to kind of hear your thoughts on how we might encourage, some additional use of signage in those projects, or just so that folks know that, the city's stormwater program is participating in that. I think it is a good opportunity to get a little more education and outreach out of it.
Yes, sir. Totally agree. And it is an active conversation. Communications is heavily involved.
Okay, great.
Any other questions?
Yes, Justin, I have a question. This is Claudia. How are you?
Hi, Claudia. Doing well.
Great. So, Justin, now that we're at the end of the fiscal year, do you have a feel for how much of the funding went to commercial versus residential projects?
Well, I will say majority would go to residential.
Okay.
The bigger projects obviously are commercial. I would say that on top of my head, the only commercial for this past year was the Longleaf Hotel. But it was also a pretty expensive project. It was about a third of the year's total reimbursement. So most of it has gone to residential properties. Some of those residential properties are a condo association had put in 4 bioretentions this fiscal year. So that isn't your single family home. That's your slightly higher visibility, impacting several, bigger footprint, impacting several properties in that case. So I would say majority of it does go to residential properties at present.
So you mentioned the Crabtree Creek project, or the Crabtree Boulevard project, I guess I should say. So how would you, I'm sorry?
No, that's correct, Claudia, sorry.
Okay, so how would you categorize that as residential or commercial?
That would be commercial.
Okay.
That was approved last fiscal year, fiscal year 19.
Okay.
So,
thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Any other questions? All right, we can jump into the 4 projects I have pending review. All right, so like I said, I have 4 projects. All are located in the Pigeon House branch watershed, which means they would be eligible for 90% reimbursement. Some of these date back to the beginning of COVID during the March timeframe. So they have either moved forward, pending review and approval, or have been waiting to implement these projects. And all have been a result of coordination and cooperation, in spite of these COVID conditions. So first project is residential property. Next slide, Kelly. Thanks. First properties at Penn Road, residential property. Even though they're eligible for 90% reimbursement, they did cap their reimbursement on both practices, and I can get into that at a later slide. It is a green roof and underground cistern. It's located right there between Wade Avenue and Glenwood Avenue. Or sorry, St. Aug and Oakwood Cemetery. Apologize. Next slide. And here's some plans and drawings showing the location of each device. Pretty much underground cistern in the backyard, capturing the runoff from the back of the house, and then a substantially sized green roof on the front of the house. That green roof is 1,020 square feet, not 10,020 square feet. For clarification, as you see here, the reimbursement is being capped for both practices. The applicant capped the reimbursement for a couple reasons. One, in hopes to improve his odds of project approval, and to avoid the policy required land use restriction that would be required for a reimbursement that exceeds $30,000. All right, next slide, if there's no questions. Here's a picture of the underground cistern before it's underground and while it's being installed. It is not quite complete on site yet. The one thing that makes this system unusual is that passive drawdown is not possible underground in this setup because the slope doesn't cooperate. So it's actually a active drawdown. So there will be a small pump to draw the level of the cistern down to recharge it between storm events. The other part of the project is the green roof. It's 6 inches of media. It's only accessible at this point by a ladder because the home is not complete. So I have not been up there to date, but this was installed a few weeks ago. All right, next slide, please. All right, these are the site metrics, water quality metrics. This is a total, so the total nitrogen removed, and then the divided by the total cost of getting that pollution removal metric there, the 74,000, which is slightly higher. That is going to be attributed to the green roof, which does not remove as much nitrogen as most other project types the program supports. All right, next slide. Here are the breakdowns of the costs for the two projects. Pretty much in line with comparable project types. Next slide. The total here showing 74% reimbursement of that amount, which is just under the $30,000 threshold I previously mentioned. Next slide. I have it broken down here showing each project, how it compares to other similar comparable projects. Underground cistern, it's pretty much in the middle of the pack here. Next slide, please. General maintenance as it is for all cistern, except in this case, there will be maintenance of that passive active drawdown pump, active passive drawdown pump. All right, here's the green roof. There are not many comparables here. As I mentioned, they are more expensive. They do not remove as much nitrogen. Smaller applications do not make them as effective at removing nitrogen. And that's demonstrated here. Next slide, please. And there's your green roof maintenance requirements. Slide, please. And they would be required for a 10-year maintenance period, if approved. So, Jonathan, I'll take questions on this project, or I can vote on this project, or we can look at the end, all of them. It's up to you.
Yeah, Justin, let's plan on voting after each project. Obviously, we still have some time for discussion on this one or questions, but just as a note, I think for these Rainwater Awards projects, we'll vote individually this time.
All right, fair enough.
Yeah, so are there any questions for Justin on that Penn Road project?
Justin, could you describe a little bit more, Justin, about the land use restrictions that are tipped out by staying under the $30,000?
If I heard you correctly, Evan, you said expound a little bit on the land use restrictions, what's required?
Yeah, what would be required if it were over 30,000?
So yes, sir, good question. It's pretty much covenant restrictions on the property. They have to be recorded with the Register of Deeds office. So they'll draft up an addendum to their legal agreement that they're already have entered into with the city. There will be a surveyed map that will designate a area that needs to be protected. You can't dump snow melt in this area. You can't build a home in this area. It's protected. It's tied to the deed for the duration of the maintenance period. So it will sunset after 10 years. There is cost associated with that, getting the survey and usually an attorney involved to weed through some of that paperwork to get that recorded and acceptable for both parties.
But so the project, the petitioner is still held to that 10-year maintenance agreement here. It just does not get recorded with the deed.
Correct. Yes, sir.
And if there's a sale of the property within that 10-year period?
The policy allows for two options there. The original owner, the original applicant, prior to selling the property, would have to reimburse a prorated amount based on the remainder of the maintenance period, or the new owner can assume the remainder of the maintenance period. And we actually are going through our first run at this with a very, very small project little depaving that was approved back in 2017. So about to have a test case with this, and we're working with the city attorney's office. We were this morning even to get this hashed out. So the policy protects us in that regard, and we were about to have a test case or something to fall back on here very soon. All right, any other questions for Penn Road?
All right, if there's no other questions for Justin on Penn Road, is there a motion to approve that project? All right, Mr. Senior, is there a second? All right, I got Evan on the second there, and all in favor? All right, the vote appears unanimous. Approval for the project at Penn Road.
The second project, this is a bioretention located at William Peace University, address 15 East Peace Street. Once again, Pigeon House Branch, eligible for 90%. It's a good size bioretention located directly in the center of campus, so high visibility. The applicant seems pretty excited about this project. Next slide, please. This is the existing site conditions. A lot of impervious runoff flows through this area presently through these riprap channels and conveyances. So the thought is, why not treat the first 1 inch or as much as they can prior to it leaving the property there. Next slide, please. Here's a quick diagram showing the gray area showing all the impervious surface flowing to that area. The rain garden or the bioretention will be located in the far right of this diagram, this drawing. Next slide, please. Here is a lot of the upstream areas, all different paths leading to the same general area. There is some additional roof runoff that's contributing as well. Next slide, please. Here is a rendering of the future bioretention. The main takeaway here is that the existing site conditions just work great for it. So it will allow for, in your larger rain events, for the emergency spillway to be activated and enter into these existing stone riprap conveyances. So they're using those to their advantage. The system will have an underdrain. The soils perform remarkably well here, but there was concern about with it being such a high profile, high visibility project in a location that they don't want to take the risk of there being any sort of standing water in a system like this. So any questions on location, design? If not, we can move to the next slide. The water quality metrics are really attractive. That's due in large part to the amount of impervious that is flowing through, or impervious runoff that is flowing through this area. And their costs are kept pretty low as well. I think a lot of it has to do with staff, William Peace University staff helping with the design of this. So that reduces some of the costs there. Up here's your projected cost, the breakdown. Very cost effective considering what will be there and what it will be doing. Any questions on the cost breakdown? Pretty general.
I just find it interesting they don't have any design costs. Are they absorbing that, or how's that being handled?
Yep, good question. I kind of breezed over that. They had an intern who was actually an NC State student that did all the design, did all of the legwork on putting this package together. The several meetings with staff. So I think they saved a lot of money there. And it also, being an intern with William Peace, it's really the community there, or some of the staff members there are excited about it. So they were able to just really, the only cost really is the actual install of material. Next slide, please. You can see it's the, compared to other bioretentions, which are generally your larger projects of this sort, it is one of the most cost-effective we've come across. just the other little note here, if you look, those two on Matt Drive, which were not even really a close second, but both were approved by a majority of y'all in previous visits. So it just, I think that's a positive trend to show how the cost effectiveness has almost gone, it's gone down over the last several years. Next slide. General maintenance requirements for bioretentions. And that is all. Next slide, please. That's all I have for P Street. They would be required 10-year maintenance period as well. No land use restriction.
All right, any questions for Justin on 15 East P Street? Mark, was that a question or?
It's a motion to approve. I got unmute.
All right. So is there a motion to approve? We'll say Mark got that one. Is there a second? All right, David, and all in favor? All right, the vote is unanimous, and 15 East P Street is approved.
All right, jumping right into number 3. This is the one that is located between Glenwood and Wade Avenue. I got ahead of myself earlier. Once again, Pigeon House Branch, eligible for 90%, and it's a permanent paver driveway. The owner does plan on pretty much maximizing the 1-to-1 ratio of additional impervious runoff being directed to it. So some of the roof will be directed to it as well. Next slide, please. Here is a proposal drawing. It's going to be placed over an existing gravel driveway pad. And this existing footprint is considered impervious by the city of Raleigh at present. So there's going to be no increase in footprint here. The retaining wall shown on the top or the north side, I guess, of the driveway is not eligible and for reimbursement. It is not part of the cost presented today. Next slide, please. Here is your existing conditions. It's actually a small little alleyway that services several homes in this area. All right, this is where the additional runoff will be coming from. It's going to be pretty much the whole side of the house. Maximize that 1-to-1 ratio as previously mentioned. Next slide. Just a couple of takeaways here. They're going to disperse that additional square footage of runoff so that it's not in a single location, and that's per NCDEQ guidance. Infiltration test is still pending to see if they'll have an infiltration or detention system. The cost does not include the policy required $5 per square foot, which is the cost of doing a traditional driveway. The policy states that for permanent paver projects, you take the total cost, you subtract the cost of a traditional driveway within that same footprint would be, and that arrives you to the acceptable cost. And that's how we handle that today, and it'll be demonstrated on the next slide. And then the permitting is not needed because it's not expanding the footprint. Next slide. Here's your water quality metrics. This is based on a detention system, not an infiltration system, because once again, the infiltration test has not been completed. Pretty standard or pretty comparable nitrogen reduction metric on this as well when compared to other permanent paver projects. Next slide, please. So this is what I was talking about the total cost minus the cost of a traditional driveway in this footprint leaves you with the acceptable cost. 90% of that acceptable cost gets us to the breakdown. Projected cost, this is the breakdown of everything there. You see that the retaining wall is not part of that. And once again, how we arrived at that acceptable cost as well. Next slide, please. Here's comparisons of other permanent paver projects. Once again, the most recent is right below that East Drury Lane, approved last year. So next slide, please. Maintenance requirements, same slide as it's for all perennial paver projects, and they will be required to maintain the system for a 10-year period. Once again, no land use restriction. And are there any questions for 1416 Glenwood Avenue?
Any questions for Justin? All right, well, I move to approve the project at 1416 Glenwood Avenue. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, Mr. Senior, all in favor? All right, Ken's got his hand up. The vote's unanimous. And the project at 1416 Glenwood Avenue is approved.
All right, final project here, 1829 Reeves Drive. What started as a single rain garden, which probably would have been a staff approval, turned into potentially 2 rain gardens, which did push it up over the staff review threshold. Once again, Pigeon House Branch eligible for 90% reimbursement. It's only 330 square feet of rain garden being proposed. So one single family home. Next slide. Here are the potential footprints here. One's in the front, outside of the right of way, and one in the back coming off the driveway to capture some, there's a shed to the right that is not, you can see it in the first picture. Some of that runoff would be directed to it. Here are some of the design that were submitted. You know, pretty straightforward. Both have 10 inches of ponding. All pretty much factored 10 here, keeping it simple. No questions. We can move to the next slide. You know, cost metric. It's very comparable to other rain gardens. Pretty small footprint. This is about the size that we would look at your staff level reviews. Next slide, please. Cost breakdown. There was not a lot of itemization in the estimates I received, but the total cost doesn't really exceed what we're seeing across the board, and that'll be fleshed out in the next slide. See, it's right there in the middle for the cost and how much treatment getting in return. And you'll see the next slide will show the general maintenance requirements for rain gardens. They'd be subject to a 10-year maintenance period, and once again, no land use restriction. So that's all I have on Reeves Drive. They were presented in order of when they were received.
All right, any questions for Justin on the project at Reeves Drive? No questions. All right, well, I move to approve the project at 1829 Reeves Drive. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, Mr. Senior, all in favor? All right, the vote is unanimous and the project at 1829 Reeves Drive is approved. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you all very much.
All right, Dale, I think you are next up on the agenda with one drainage assistance project to review.
That is correct. Yeah, so since our last meeting in March didn't utilize all of our FY20 funding, we're going to present one project at this SMAC meeting that will sort of take up the bulk or the almost all of the remaining FY20 funding before we start to get into FY21 project approvals. But you can go ahead and go to the next slide, Kelly. So just to recap, so far in fiscal year 2029 projects were approved. And up until potential approval of this project that we're presenting today, we had $243,000 left of our $1.5 million annual budget for the drainage assistance program. Next slide. Look at the pending projects list. Hopefully you can see this one a little bit better than when I present there at the municipal building, a little bit larger, a little bit easier to see, but you can see the projects ranked there, the top 28. There's currently still around 83 projects or so, I think, listed on the pending project list. Haven't been a lot of new projects that have come in and been scored as a result of sort of the pandemic, when we put a little pause on our drainage investigations to sort of verify conditions and take measurements before prioritizing those projects. So the first ranked project there is Knoll Court, a project that was originally identified in terms of the Drainage Assistance Program back in 2018. So that's the project. 3416 Knoll Court will be the project that we'll be looking at today. Location, it is just west of 440 and north of the North Pine Museum of Art. It's actually sections of the North Pine Museum of Art are just to the east of that in a subdivision there in West Raleigh. I did want to take a minute to mention, I believe at our last SMAC meeting in March, there was a request for a socioeconomic map regarding drainage assistance complaints and drainage assistance projects. We're working on that map. We've done a lot of work over the past couple of months with that map. Did think we're getting close to finalize that map. Was hopeful that we could show that map and discuss that map in an in-person meeting instead of virtual, because I'm sure there will be a lot of questions that kind of come out of that map. If that happens to not be the case, we can get that map out early ahead of a SMAC meeting, a virtual SMAC meeting, for review and comment, so that we're prepared to discuss that map at that time. So that's just an update on that specific map, but this map shows, our recently completed and active projects, and Knoll Court there with the black star. 3460 Court, platted in 1964, built in 1965, well within what would be considered the riparian buffer now. You see the tributary to House Creek in the backyard, and some of the meander bends of that tributary that get pretty close to the foundation of the home, within about 12 feet of the structure there located at 3416 Knoll Street. Just for reference, the drainage area to that point is about 40 acres. Here's one of the better pictures that kind of demonstrate the erosion. The bank there is about 8 feet tall, and you can actually see some, if you look close, some undermining of the deck or the patio, the concrete patio there, starting to occur. And while we don't consider the patio the part of the structure, that is, an immediate threat, but we do take our measurements in terms of public safety and health from the top of the bank to the actual structure, the actual home, and not to patio or decks, just as an FYI. So pretty simple here. About 80 linear feet of stabilization there in the bin closest to the structure. Given the constraints with distance from the bottom of the toe of the channel to the top of the slope, probably going to have to do some sort of rock boulder, imbricated wall, rock boulder toe to make up some of the grade difference, and then revegetation, sloping, matting, and revegetation of that bank. So just a funding overview. Estimated project costs for 3416 Knoll Court are $225,000. If you remember, we got $243,000 left of FY18 or FY20 funding. So that brings the remaining balance of FY20 to $18,000. That $18,000 will be rolled over for fiscal year 21 projects. So we can utilize that little bit of leftover money as we move forward into project approvals for FY21. Try to keep it pretty straightforward and simple for our first virtual meeting. But if you have any questions or comments, please let me know.
Yeah, I think, yeah, go ahead, Tavin.
I'm sorry, I have COVID brain and I halfway remember things from earlier this year.
Me too.
Can you remind me about how it works? Because I think we borrowed against fiscal year 21 for one of the projects. Am I remembering that correctly? And like what that is about?
Yeah, so we've actually borrowed against fiscal year 20
Okay.
funding. And on the second or so slide with those approved projects, those 9 approved projects, one of those is the $245,000 for the acquisition of 2100 and 2104 Hillock Drive. So it was a project that we didn't have enough funding for when we originally
Right, because
approved
we had to buy the properties. I remember it now. It's coming back.
Right.
Okay.
So we haven't repaid that funding yet, but we do, and Wayne can discuss potentially a little bit more. We do have an idea of exactly sort of where that funding is going to come from to refund that $245,000 that we borrowed against fiscal year 20.
Cool. I just don't want it to get lost. That's my main concern. I'm sure that there's a plan, but
there is a plan. There's a plan, and we don't want it to get lost either. So we're sort of tracking that $245,000, and first to sort of when there's the potential for funding, freed up funding from closed projects. I am quick to remind Wayne that we have a $245,000 sort of borrowing project there.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. And if I could just make a quick comment, I think we'll be ready to bring some more information on that plan back at the August meeting.
Yes, Ms. Graham.
Thank you. So I have a comment and a question that I think that I know rather is relevant both to the drainage assistance program and the stormwater rewards. I'm sorry, rainwater rewards. And I recall at one of our earlier meetings, we talked briefly about looking at doing a root cause analysis of these particular situations that result in requests from the residents for drainage assistance or for participating in rainwater rewards. And I still think that's very important that we take a look at that because that's going to help inform stormwater management about future plans and recommendations to council about ordinances and policies as it relates to stormwater. So I don't know how much progress has been made on that. It was my understanding that the staff was either already working on that or had it in mind to work on it, but I just wanted to remind everyone. Thank you.
Excellent point, Ms. Graham, and point well taken. And I do believe many of these projects, and this last one that Dale showed was a good example of that. Many of these are issues that have already been addressed by more proactive regulations. Like that house, it was built in 1965, would not be built where it was under our current regulations. But I think your point is still a good one. Are there continued regulatory changes that we can make that would save us from having to do more of these DA projects in 10 or 15 years from now?
Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, two things that jumped out when you look at that one. The first was the cost per linear foot. And that's like $2,800 a foot, which seems on the high side. I was just curious as to why that's so high. The second was it looked like access to the creek is going to be tough. How you guys are planning on doing that? You're going to have to get easements from the adjacent owners to work out.
Yeah, so you somewhat answered your first question with your second question. Access is one of the reasons for the increased cost. The additional sort of increase is the large rock imbricated wall that we anticipate will be needed to kind of make up the slope. We have talked to the adjacent property owner if you're facing the house to the right, and they are generally on board with donating easement for us to allow access. The only potential drawback is that access is sort of on the high side of the stream. So there'll need to be some work done to get equipment down sort of in the stream to be able to do the stabilization. So that is kind of the reason, that is the reason that you see sort of a higher cost. In addition to that, we've also seen over the past probably 6 months increases in our design fees, what the designers, our engineers are charging for development of these stabilization plans and construction drawings, as well as still recent bid sort of climate has still, from what we've seen in recent bidding of projects, still seems to be climbing up despite the pandemic.
All right, any other questions for Dale on the project at Noel Court? All right, if there's no other questions, is there a motion to approve the project? All right, Mr. Senior, is there a second? All right, I've got Evan in the top right there. All in favor of approval? The vote appears unanimous and the project at 3416 Noel Court is approved.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Dale. All right, so next up on our agenda, we've got the Stormwater Design Manual. I've got Ben and Ashley down for this one. So looks like Ashley, you're gonna get us started.
Yes, I'll get us started and Ben can just feel free to chime in as needed.
Okay, great, thanks.
I will let Kelly pull up the presentation for me. So I'm also going to try to keep this pretty brief. First off, I just wanted to make sure everyone was aware that the draft Stormwater Design Manual is up and available for public comment on the City of Raleigh's website. That includes all the individual chapters. I took a screenshot so y'all can see if you haven't taken a look already at our website. But we've got it broken out, by individual chapters. And then we also have links to all of the design checklists and submittal checklists that we've developed, as well as the sample lot grading plans. So that comment period, and I don't know why I can't see the bottom of this slide, but it began on June 9th. We extended it a little bit from when we had expected to. So currently, according to the website, it closes on Friday, July 17th. We wanted to give a little extra time because of the 4th of July holiday in there. But we've had a few requests already to extend that more toward the end of the month. And I think that we more than likely will. So we'll be probably sending out an update to that. We did a very good job pushing out the information. Kristen Freeman was very helpful, and also Katie, her counterpart with Development Services. So we've done several email blasts, some social media stuff just to get the word out so that we get hopefully as much good input and comment on this as possible. But I just wanted to make y'all aware of that. That's kind of the status of the overall project. Next slide, Kelly. So the main reason that we're doing this presentation today is y'all have requested at the last SMAC meeting that we had to go into a little more detail on the proposed downstream assessment, which is one of the new items that we're proposing to add in Chapter 2 of the manual. The idea was that y'all wanted a little bit better idea of exactly what went into this and kind of the steps of the downstream assessment, just to have a better understanding. So that's what we'll do for the next few minutes. Currently, just to set a baseline, our UDO has certain requirements for detention on large sites, and it's all surrounding the idea of controlling peak rates of runoff leaving the site. So basically, you're looking at each location, each outfall of the site where water's leaving, and you can't have any increase in your peak rate of runoff between your pre and post development. for the 2 and 10 year design storms. That's kind of the baseline of our expectation now. There are a few exemptions that code allows currently. One of them is that you can do a little extra analysis. You can go, instead of just the 2 and 10, you can do the 2, 10, and 25 year storm events. And if you show less than a 10% increase for any point of discharge there for those events, then you can get an exemption from doing on-site detention. There are also 2 current options that you can do an engineering study. So we already have kind of a study that people can do if they want to get out of detention on a site due to timing issues. They can either show no benefit to detaining, where if they were to do detention, they really would have no impact at all on the flood levels downstream, or they can show us with an engineering study that by doing detention and the way that the timing of the peak discharges would impact each other, that you would actually make flooding worse downstream, in which case, obviously, we would prefer not to have detention then. So that's kind of the current baseline for our larger developments and what we expect in terms of detention. Next slide. So with the downstream assessment, the way that I've heard this described, and I think it's pretty good, is that it's a shift in how you think about detention and looking at this on a development. The idea is that you're kind of taking your blinders off. You're looking more big picture and seeing how is this development impacting, you know, the entire overall drainage system. How does it fit in and how does it impact further downstream? So you kind of stop looking just at where the water's leaving the site and you look broader out at the impact. Obviously, the further out you get from the development, the less impact you see. And that's kind of like, you know, obviously if you threw like a pebble into a lake or something and you see the ripple effect, it dissipates the further out it gets. And it's the same way for the impacts to the entire drainage area. The further out you get from the development, the less impact you're going to see. But the idea is that you're going to develop this zone of influence, which we'll get into a little bit later, that 10% point. And within that zone of influence, you're trying to maintain the peak flows at all these major points so that you're not impacting that overall drainage system in a negative way. So, and if you do that, you're hopefully also maintaining the existing velocities, which hopefully are non-erosive. And again, recognizing that sometimes detention may not be helpful. So that's kind of the goal of what the downstream assessment does. There are already a lot of places throughout the country, but also here in North Carolina that do this, and I'll kind of get into that as we go along too. Okay, next slide, Kelly. Okay, so to give y'all a background on the way that we're proposing to use the downstream assessment in the manual, we're looking at 2 different things. We're looking at what we call small site development versus large site development. So if you recall, small site development is the generally older residential lots or smaller commercial lots, or things that are part of a small subdivision, like a less than acre residential subdivision or less than half acre commercial subdivision. So older and or smaller lots in the city. These are the lots that used to be completely exempt from stormwater requirements until in 2016, we made that text change that made these lots, these what we call small sites, subject to a max impervious based on their zoning. So that's what we mean by the small site developments. These are projects that are not subject to the bigger runoff and nitrogen requirements. They have that max impervious based on their zoning instead. So for a small site development, we are proposing in the draft manual that the downstream assessment be required in one of 2 cases. It would be required if we knew that there's downstream structural flooding that had been identified. So we know that downstream people are already having impacts and we want to make sure this development won't make it worse. The other is if you chose to change flow types or discharge point locations on your site. So if you're changing the flow pattern significantly, if you're going from sheet flow to concentrated, or if you're changing where the water leaves the site so that maybe a downstream neighbor that was not previously receiving runoff was, then this is the kind of analysis we would want to see. So those are the only 2 times when a small site would be required under the draft manual to do this assessment. However, we are giving this as an option for people to do if they wanted to exceed their max impervious based on the zoning. So right now, the UDO gives them two options to exceed their max impervious based on zoning. One is to do essentially a downstream flood analysis to show that they're not impacting flood levels on the neighbors more than 0.04 feet, which is basically like half an inch. The other option that code gives currently is to do an on-site volume-based or GSI stormwater control measure to deal with that difference in runoff that you could expect, volume that you could expect coming off from the extra impervious. So code already allows an analysis. We're just kind of quantifying what we want that to look like. Because right now, code really isn't specific on what that downstream analysis looks like if a small site wanted to exceed its impervious. So this is kind of fleshing that out more and laying the expectations for what we would want to see. But it is, again, just an option. If someone stayed underneath those max impervious limitations, if someone did substitution of impervious, or if someone chose to do an actual device on site, then this would not be a requirement for the small site development. Next slide, please.
Hey, Ashley, can I ask you one quick question before you move on from the small sites?
Absolutely.
When you say small site, are you talking like 12,000 square feet that would trigger, review for a mass grading permit, or is it, something different, larger
It's something
than that?
It's something different. So what we call a small site, it could be for a residential lot, it could be any size residential lot. It's for a residential lot, you're looking at two different triggers. You're looking at the age of the lot, so the older lots that were in existence prior to our stormwater regulations. So if it's single family or duplex on the lot as the use, if they're those older grandfathered lots, then regardless of the size, they're considered a small site.
Mm-hmm.
And you can have recombined, with other similar grandfathered lots, and you don't lose that so-called exemption,
Mm-hmm.
the larger stormwater requirements. For commercial sites, it's a little different. Before I go there, residential. If you also had a residential subdivision of like 1 acre or less come in now today, then they would be considered small site.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, but existing lots, like I said, it could be any size residential for a single family or duplex.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, for commercial, they're generally the same. It's the older grandfathered lots, especially the small ones. Like if you had a commercial subdivision under a half acre, then technically they're small site development.
Gotcha. Thanks, Ashley.
I have a question for you, Ashley. Do we have a standardized way of calculating these runoffs? Or is it left up to a civil engineer to create the math?
Well, there are standard ways of doing the calculations, absolutely. And our draft manual, if you look in chapter 3 on the hydrology section, goes into acceptable methodologies for doing calculations.
Okay.
To Mr. Montaylor, I have a question. When it says under the required structural flooding is identified downstream, if no structural flooding has been identified downstream, then the downstream assessment does not need to take place. Is that correct?
That is correct, unless they triggered that second provision of changing the flow type or the location of discharge. But yes, if there is no documented downstream structural flooding, then that wouldn't trigger a downstream assessment.
And how is that?
So we have a database that we have a database that we maintain internally in the city. Anytime that we get these documented cases, we have a layer in our GIS system that will flag it. And so when a development comes in for review, the reviewer checks that. They look downstream of the project and see if we have any of those structural flooding complaints. And that's generally how we catch those and would apply this requirement.
Must be called in by the resident or an individual. This is not something that we go and see, correct?
Correct. I mean, if we are doing a site visit and documenting ourselves, then we certainly can do that. Speaking, it is a resident or property owner has provided us the information and the documentation that this structural flooding happened. And so we keep a record of that so that we can make sure that with any new development, we can apply these triggers that, and like I said, we already do have this in our code that if requirements or extra requirements to do detention if it's needed. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. All right, Kelly, if you could get the next slide, thank you. So large site development is basically anything that's not a small site, which is very helpful, but it's basically any of the larger developments that are subject to the full-on requirements for nutrient loading, treatment, or detention in our code. And these are usually, like I said, the larger projects. So you'll notice that the requirement for doing a downstream analysis, the triggers for requirements are the exact same for the small and large sites. So for a large site, again, if there's known structural flooding, they would be required to look at this. And then if, again, they wanted to change flow patterns or discharge points. So we tried to limit the scope of when this is a requirement, but broaden when it would be optional. So the optional time for a large site development to be able to do this study would be if they wanted to try to not have on-site detention measures. If they wanted to say that because of the flow timing of the watershed, that either they would trigger that no benefit to detention or adverse impact to detention, then this would be the study we want to see. So again, we're kind of building on something that exists in code now. Code currently has those two exemptions, and all it says though is that you have to do an engineering study to justify it. Here we're fleshing out, this is what we want to see for that engineering study. It's this downstream assessment. So again, the downstream assessment is new to code, but it's kind of building on things that we already have in there now for both the small and the large sites. Next slide, Kelly.
Quick question, Ashley. How does this address structural flooding post-construction? Because you keep saying that you have to identify structural flooding prior to construction while they do the assessment. But if none exists until after construction, then what's the remedy?
So there is, and Ben can jump in here if I say something wrong, but realistically, there shouldn't be any. If the analysis was performed correctly and had correct assumptions, then it shouldn't be that the development was triggering any new structural flooding. But realistically, there's nothing in our code for a flooding that happens, say, 2 or 3 years after a development is closed out. How do we prove that that development caused that structural flooding? The only thing that we can do, and what this is designed to do, is to prevent problems up front. And if we know that there are already issues downstream, we want to make absolutely sure that this project won't make them worse. I don't know that that fully answers the question, but
Well, in short answer, no, it doesn't. Now being on the SMAC committee and also being from construction, I'm getting people in my neighborhood who are now they know that I'm part of the SMAC committee. They're coming to me and asking me for guidance on how do they deal with infill construction where flooding begins after the new structure's put up. There doesn't seem to be a remedy in there at this point.
In the code, I would say that you're correct. The code doesn't have the ability to go after previous development like that. What is available to people is it basically becomes a private matter between the citizen and the property owner or developer. North Carolina drainage law generally defaults to that downstream properties have to accept a reasonable amount of water, but what's reasonable is up to a court.
Yeah, so basically we have a non-cure is what we've got.
Well, this is not intended. This is intended to avoid a problem up front.
I understand that, and being a developer builder, I can work with my engineers to construct a model that always satisfies me and what results I want. And what I'm asking is, so basically what I'm asking is there a way to mandate a very specific standardized set of calculations? Because simply put, if you take out a 2,000 square foot structure and you replace it with a 5,000 square foot structure, you now have created a 250% increase in impervious surface. Common sense tells you you're increasing the runoff from the property. It's going to have an effect somewhere downstream, but you can't see that effect until sometime in the future because it is cumulative. Runoff runoff isn't like a fire. A fire, you see it, it burns up the house and it's over. But runoff is a slow process, and most people find the damage when they fall through their floor.
Well, and I think Glenn, this is Ben Brown with
Yeah.
kind of what Ashley was getting to. I mean, these more strict requirements that are in our design manual for the analysis now is to catch a problem before it gets to permitting. Because once a site is permitted, they have certain legal entitlements that they're allowed to do and go up to. Mm-hmm. And it gets even more so once they have their CO or certificate of occupancy at that point. Because, I mean, as you know, as a builder, I mean, once you've kind of got your permanent drawings, you're allowed by the city to kind of do what you're permitted to do. I'm not sure there's a way to legally go back and say, like a year after a development, and have the city go back to that development or that current owner, who might not even be the same owner that developed the property originally, and say, you have to do this to mitigate for damage that's being caused downstream. And that's why I think most of this has been left up to that private matter in the courts, as Ashley's talking about. I'm just not sure.
And herein lies the long-term issue where the regulations or the rules that govern construction actually set up homeowners to be in civil litigation somewhere down the road. And many of the homeowners, you know, when you take a party who can afford to build, let's say a $1.5 or $2 million home, and it abuts or shares a border with a downstream border with a house that's $300,000, and that's all that person can afford. They actually can't afford to fight back. They're stuck. And we actually have lots of examples of that, where a small home is taken with regards to infill, where you take out a small structure, you put back a large one, and then after construction's closed out, CO's issued, that's when the problems start. That doesn't seem equitable to me.
And I totally get it, but this is why the proposed draft manual is adding these other factors in to justify this drain analysis. If there's other ways out there, I mean, we kind of brainstorm like with our consultants and looking at other communities, there's not any silver bullet way to kind of handle this. I mean, and that's kind of why it's out for public comment now. I mean, right now, to require this analysis to go downstream and make sure you're not changing the flow and nature of that water is a lot different than what we have today. I mean, just, I don't want that to be lost, is that the draft manual, if passed as it's written today, will have a lot more analysis in it for these new developments as to what's going to happen downstream and for them to mitigate that. Now, I really emphasize that point because it is a draft manual right now. It is not a version or anything like that. So if there are other ways or other things we could be doing, the comment period is totally open for that, because we've kind of got together for about a year now with our consultant and with local governments. We came up with that. But if there's other ways we're missing, we're more than happy to open that up.
Yeah, one of the things that we might want to consider, and I just had a meeting with Justin, and everybody understands that this particular problem is a little personal to me. But Justin was out here to do a consult on possibly putting using the program so we could do a rain garden on my property. But in order for a rain garden to go in and city to participate in the rain garden program, you have to be you're looking to control runoff from your impervious surface. And if you've already got measures in place, well, then you can't access that help. And if you've got a property next door that's created additional runoff, even though they've done the calcs and they are, they're within compliance based on flood study or whatever it is they have to do to get their permits, it still creates an issue later. But now there's no remedy other than the downstream homeowner spending a fortune to fix the problem that we tried to mitigate in the first place. The system doesn't catch everything, is what I'm saying. And so what I'm looking for is how could we work? Could you the rainwater or rain garden program, could that be expanded to deal with runoff that comes from your neighbor's property? There's no room over there. You got room on yours. How do you help these people?
I can let Kevin.
Because that's what it really comes down to. How do we help our constituents? That's what a rain garden program is for, to help them, which also benefits the community.
I totally agree, but the Raleigh Rainwater Rewards program is set up that makes sure you are treating a certain amount of impervious. If you're counting impervious off-site, you're technically not in control of always getting that impervious. So that's kind of where the rule for that water quality program came into. Now, with the drainage assistance program, you have to have a public contribution of water for the city to participate in that. Now, either program is available for being changed or replicated some way to better help our citizens, but that's kind of the meaning behind those two programs. For the water quality aspect, because you're treating your own impervious, because you're in control of that, and for the drainage assistance, the city was helping you out, and some of their runoff was contributing to your flooding. Now, if there's changes can be made to those other programs, that's something to talk about.
Yeah, well, that's what we're talking about. You're talking about two things that haven't addressed your neighbor. If city conditions contribute to the flooding on your property, the city will help. We've already dealt with lots of that. If you're trying to increase your impervious surface allocation, or you need to deal with runoff created on your own property, you have a rain garden program. Neither one of those situations addresses infill development that is now impacting your property, because it's private property to private property, not public to private for your own structure and runoff. See where the hole is?
This is John Page.
Hey, John.
Would it be possible to just get a rundown of some of what perhaps what other municipalities in North Carolina are doing that experience large levels of infill and redevelopment, if they do have some type of retroactive procedure? I don't think they do.
They don't. We've done that research as part of our benchmarking for the draft manual. Like we looked at what other people were doing across the state and across the country, and there really isn't a lot of regulation on these types of infill development. And there certainly wasn't anything retroactive that we saw.
Gotcha. Evan, I think you had a comment.
Yeah, I have a question arising out of some of this, and it may be related to what Mr. Taylor is raising, but I'm curious about the cumulative impacts, especially of these small sites. If the first redevelopment project has no complaints of structural flooding, and then the 2nd through 10th infill developments in a watershed have no complaints of structural flooding, at a certain point, at the nth infill project, you may have complaints of structural flooding. It's not due to that last increment of development, it's due to the first 3 development infill that happened before. How we could address that.
Evan, I'm having a hard time hearing you on my end. I'm getting a lot of feedback from another microphone, I think.
Yeah, so sounds like that's dissipated now. Hello. All right.
Yeah, Evan, that's much better now.
Okay. So the question is, how could we address the cumulative impacts of multiple infills where impervious surface is increased on a lot? It's not the first infill development that creates the structural flooding complaint, and it may not be the 10th, but at a certain point you add so much more impervious surface, and the last guy in with a development project winds up blocked or having to take extreme measures because of the cumulative impacts of everything else. Any thoughts on
that? That's an interesting point, that it is a cumulative effect. However, I could take you over by Daniels Middle School and show you a couple of properties that have infill construction behind them, where downspouts have been routed to point directly at the downstream property. And that's perfectly acceptable under current construction rules. Those are ones where you could actually point to and say, this is exactly where the problem is. There are other ones where you're basically checkerboarding, where you build a property here, the next one doesn't, maybe 2 doors down, you get another one, and eventually they all fill together. And yes, you do end up with a cumulative problem from 2, 3, 4, 10 pieces to 10 different construction projects. And then the last one, you go, oh, that guy did it, but it's not exclusively his problem.
Exactly.
Yeah, I do think this is Wayne. I think it's worth mentioning, in addition to the downstream assessment that Ashley had mentioned. Ashley, you might mention, you talked about this previously, but I don't think it's come up today, the proposal related to easements that we're also adding to the drainage, the design manual that's being written.
Right, and that was what I was going to chime in to say, that we're literally talking about one piece of this draft manual right now, which is the downstream assessment. Just because that was the request last time, to get a better feel for what the downstream assessment is, and we really haven't even gotten into that yet today. But keep in mind that this is one piece. The draft manual has a lot of different, what we feel are good improvements that we're proposing. So, Mr. Taylor, one thing that we are proposing is that downspouts have to be at least 10 feet off the property line now. So you can't just outlet right onto the neighbor's property, basically. So that's one thing that we're doing. As Wayne said, we're also clarifying when we're going to be requiring easements on certain projects, including off-site easements. So if someone chose, for example, to divert water in a way that a downstream neighbor was receiving runoff where they weren't before, if they were changing those flow patterns on site, then they would have to work with their neighbors to get that private easement through the property until that water reached, a stream or some other jurisdictional feature or the city's stormwater system. And so we're building more than just the downstream assessment into this. So I don't want us to get, even though that's what we're trying to talk about this afternoon, it's not the only piece of what we're talking about with respect to stormwater and how we're dealing with new development in the city.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. I think Mark's got a comment or a question, and then I'd like to move back into your presentation, Ashley, to hear a little bit more about that downstream assessment.
Yeah, quick question. We're talking about downstream assessment, and to me that rings like they're going to have to do a flood study or some sort of an assessment. How are we going to handle that where people have to get on downstream private properties to collect the information to do that assessment? It seems to me that may be an obstacle to the practicality of the whole thing.
So you don't necessarily have to get on someone else's property to do this. There are a lot of other ways to get the basic information that you need in order to be able to do this model. I will say that the downstream assessment that we're going to go through in just a minute this is not a new concept. It's not a new methodology or procedure. It's used very often throughout the country. And like I said, even in North Carolina, I know Charlotte and Mecklenburg have done this exact same assessment. It's part of their ordinance. They have certain times when it's required versus voluntary, but they've had it in their manual and their ordinance, I think, since 2007. Greensboro, I believe, has this. Winston-Salem, I know, has it. I've spoken to them recently about how they use their downstream assessment. But again, theirs were, I want to say, between 2007 and 2009, when this requirement went into effect for them. Chatham County has a version of this using the 10% rule downstream assessment. So it's used other places successfully and has been. All those places that I mentioned in North Carolina have been doing this for over a decade. It's been a part of their regulation. So it's not a new thing. And I think, you know, as we get into this a little bit more, as I go through the steps, it may answer some of these questions. But I do want to make it clear that you don't necessarily have to get on someone else's property in order to always do this assessment. And again, keep in mind that the assessment is, generally speaking, voluntary. There are only very limited cases where this is going to even potentially be a requirement, the way that we're proposing it.
And I think that's where my question would be, is if we make it mandatory, how do we authorize people to collect the data they need to collect, or provide them some sort of an option if they can't get onto that property or can't get the information they need?
Yeah, and I don't think, just given how I've had conversations with other municipalities and given how often this is already used and the ways that you can develop a model without needing that kind of level data for what we're looking for, I don't think, truthfully, that that's going to be a major issue. But certainly, you know, we can keep that in mind as we're looking through this. So with that being said, since we only have about 20 minutes or so before the meeting is supposed to end, Kelly, could you please bring up my slideshow? Thank you. Let's just go through the steps of this. I'm going to kind of go through the next couple of slides. I don't think we really need to talk about flow timing and detention. I think we've discussed that a little bit in the past. So can you move to the next one? Okay. So the downstream assessment, the 10% rule, again, this is pretty commonly used now. But basically, any development, you're going to have an area in which you might have an effect on that contributing watershed that you're a part of. It's called the zone of influence. And after you get out of that zone of influence, anything that you've done on your site really doesn't have much of an effect. And so studies that have been used to look at this zone of influence to determine what that is. The best estimate for it is essentially that when you reach your zone of influence is basically when your project or your property's area becomes 10% of the total drainage area. At that point, that's kind of the end of your zone of influence and where people would, in theory, see impacts from a development. So, for instance, if you had a 1 acre site, you would go out to basically 10 acres, be your zone of influence, where you were 10% of the total drainage area. Next slide. And again, I'm not going to spend too long on this, just given our time, but this is just showing what the analysis might look like in terms of where you are in a particular watershed. So the one on the left, the development's kind of in the upper portion of a watershed. It's a 30-acre development, so the zone of influence calculated would be 300 acres, which is a little bit downstream on that tributary one. If you had the same 30-acre development further down, lower in that watershed, then the point where water's leaving their property, you can see here the drainage area is already 1,000 acres. And so essentially for them, they're going to hit that 10%, that zone of influence, basically where they're discharging and joining into that main stem. So that's just to show you what the drainage area difference might be depending on where you're located in the overall watershed. Next slide. So the steps in the downstream assessment, this is what I'm going to go through kind of just to give you an idea of what you're looking at. The first thing would be to determine where's water leaving from your site, so points of discharge from your site, and your pre and post development conditions for the site. Next, you're going to be figuring out where is your zone of influence, where's your 10% point. And you're doing that based on topography, This example on the right-hand side, it's probably hard to read some of that, but essentially the site in pink, you can see they're looking at where it's leaving. Their site is basically 23 acres, and then it's going into a pipe system, and then into where it's joining in with a larger drainage area. And then you can see the confluence down at the bottom as well, where it hits the main river in terms of the overall drainage area. But what you're doing is you're looking and identifying the major points, the major nodes from your site all the way until you hit that 10% point. And I will add that if this were being done as a result of a structural flooding issue, then the point of structural flooding, that property that was having structural flooding, that would also be a specific point of analysis in here. Next slide. So basically what you would do is you would develop and run a hydrologic model to determine your pre-development discharges at each point of analysis within your zone of influence until you reach that 10% ending point. And we're proposing the 1, 10, and 100-year events. The way you would be modeling your off-site areas would be essentially full build out for both your pre and post conditions, so that you're seeing the effects of this development and what it would be doing essentially. I will say, I think Mark had asked a question at the last meeting, or not asked a question, but had raised a concern about what the costs might be for some of these things. When I was speaking to a lot of our counterparts in other municipalities here in North Carolina, they didn't have a great feel for costs since we're on more the review end. But I did get some information. This is used heavily. We got it, in fact, in a lot of places, got it from ISWIM in Texas, which is, I think, the North Texas or Central Texas Council of Governments came up with that. But I have heard from them that essentially that this point right here, the hydrologic model, is where the bulk of the cost is, and it can vary widely depending on how much area you have to look at. If you're a small site, your drainage area contribution, to hit your 10% point is not as much as if you're a larger site. And again, depending on where you are in the watershed, how many points you have to analyze in between where water leaves your site and the 10% point. And then also how good is the available data. So if someone is discharging and a lot of their points are within, say, an area that has a FEMA flood study already, you've got a really good model that you can use for your peak discharges. Other areas, you may have to develop your own model for some of this. And so where I've been told that the cost driving really is how good is the existing data that people have? Are there existing hydrologic models that they can kind of build theirs off of, or are they having to create one from scratch? And that's kind of the biggest determining factor in how expensive that analysis ends up being. So I just wanted to point that out with this particular step. Next slide, please. So then after you have your model and you've run it for your pre-development conditions and you've gotten your discharges at each of those nodes, each of those points of analysis, then what you're going to do is you change your land use on the site to the post-development conditions, and you rerun that model for the same storm events. And then you're basically comparing the discharges that your model gave you for your pre and your post within that entire zone of influence until you hit that 10% point, and just seeing, do I have an increase or not in any of the, at any of those points, do I have an increase in my discharge from the site? Next slide. And so if you do have an increase in your peak flow discharges for the same storm event at any of those nodes, then the way that we're proposing to do this is that you would have 3 options. The first is you could do a hydraulic analysis then to show that whatever increases in flow you're having, you're not affecting flood levels. You're not increasing the water surface elevations more than that 0.04 feet, which again is kind of half an inch at any analysis point in the study. Or you could do an on-site device, either GSI or traditional SCM, so that you could ensure that your post-development discharges didn't exceed pre-development. Or the third option is with city approval, you could participate in an off-site project to mitigate the impacts of your development. And this is designed to give a little more flexibility in solutions for problems that we might come across. It could be anything from having someone do downstream improvements to help, which might be something that the city might want to see, or they could partner with the city on a certain project, or they could work with, you know, a neighboring property to do a project. But that would be worked out. The details of any of those would have to have city approval and be worked out with us in advance if that were a mechanism of compliance. But so those are the basic steps in the downstream assessment. Kelly, can you hit the last slide for me? So one thing that I did want to do, if any of y'all are really interested in this topic and wanted to do some more, I think that y'all will be getting copies of these presentations. Is that right, Wayne?
Yeah, they'll certainly all be made available.
Okay. So what I've done is I've included a couple of links here. If anyone is really interested, iSwim, which again comes out of Texas, it's their manual that pretty much a lot of Texas has adopted for their local jurisdictions as their own. But iSwim has a training website, and one of their training modules that they have is truly about just this downstream assessment, and it goes through a few like real world examples. It's kind of long, but they do have it broken up so that you don't have to watch the whole thing. If you are interested in doing that deep dive, I've provided that link. And then I also as part of that, Fairview, Texas has on their website a couple of good examples of downstream assessments for their jurisdiction. Again, it's not exactly necessarily what the city of Raleigh is proposing, but it would give you a good feel, again, if you wanted to get a little more into the weeds on what that analysis might look like. So I just wanted to make sure y'all were aware that those two links are there if you wanted to go look in more detail at that. Okay, and I know I'm at the end of my time, but does anyone have any additional questions right now for me?
Yeah, any other questions for Ashley? All right, I don't see any other questions right now. Ashley, thank you very much for that. That was helpful. I appreciate it. Wayne, have you had any requests for public comment, or what are you seeing on your end?
I am not seeing any requests for public comment. I've seen one suggestion from a consultant for a point of discussion, but no, I don't think that requires discussion at this point. I don't have any other citizen questions or comments.
Okay, gotcha. Any other final thoughts, comments, questions from commission members before we adjourn today? Yeah, Ms. Graham.
Yes, thank you. Before we adjourn, I would just like to follow up with my comment or my question on the topic that Father Taylor raised. And I'd like to know if there have been any discussions amongst or within stormwater management about the proposed stadium to be built in South Raleigh, in discussions as it relates to the environmental effects on properties east and west of that particular construction site, as Walnut Creek flows very close to it, or perhaps even through part of it. And if there has been discussion, I'd like to have some of stormwater management's thoughts shared with me. And if there hasn't been a discussion, I'm really interested, and I'm sure the residents of the area would be interested in knowing stormwater management's opinion about any possible environmental effects of that construction.
So I'll start, and this is Wayne, and then I'll maybe ask Ben if he has anything to add. There's not been formal discussions that I've been involved in, and I don't believe stormwater has been involved in any formal discussions at this time. We are tracking it closely, and I've heard that there's some meetings scheduled with the community and with the residents, and we welcome the opportunity to be a part of any of and all of those discussions. And as plans do start developing more specifically, we will get involved in those discussions. And then if there are rezoning requests that will come in as part of that, we often get pulled into those types of discussions as well. If there are, for example, conditions that can and should be part of the rezoning request, that would be a time that we would get involved in the conversation as well. But we certainly welcome the opportunity to provide comments. It's a very significant project. And yes, to the point made earlier, I do believe green stormwater infrastructure would be a very appropriate addition to help mitigate any impacts that project would have on the environment and on stormwater flooding impacts in that area.
Thank you.
Yeah, Reverend Taylor.
Wanted to take a moment to an opinion and maybe just give a charge. Just wanted to tell the group, just cannot express really the outrage I felt after reading the News and Observer article about the Terry Sanford building discharging sewage into Walnut Creek. And this group knows the history. In 1887, the city of Raleigh began dumping raw sewage into Walnut Creek. City Council in 1957 zoned that same area as a place during segregation for Black people to live. So after dumping sewage for 70 years, this area is then zoned as a place for Black people to live, Rochester Heights. And so I used to, when I would give this environmental impact on the effect of environmental racism, would say for 70 years, the city dumped raw sewage. But now I have to really change the narrative that for 133 years, Raleigh and the feds have dumped raw sewage into Southeast Raleigh. And as one who is a resident, because I'm pastor of a church in that area, that's just greatly disturbing. So I just wanted to show that transparency. And then also as a charge to this group, is there anything we can do? I have an answer to that. I know it's a federal building, so it's not under our jurisdiction. However, is there something we could do to partner with the city as well, perhaps to get the word out to residents? I was very interested to see Matthew Starr's quote in News and Observer, former chair of this commission, talking about the elevated rates of E. coli found south of the discharge area. So a statement and then really a charge to this group to see if there's anything we can do in response to what's happening at the Sanford building.
Thanks, Reverend Taylor. Yeah, Wayne, I was going to ask you if there are any updates on that facility at this point. I know the EPA is now involved.
Yes, EPA is very much involved, and it's in the middle of an enforcement action. So I'm a little bit limited in what I can tell you, but I can tell you the city has issued a notice of violation and a cease and desist order, and there have been some response by GSA, who manages the Terry Sanford Federal Building. The city's enforcement action is somewhat limited because it is a federal facility. So that puts EPA and North Carolina DEQ as the primary enforcement agencies. We have had multiple conversations with both of those groups to express our outrage, really, as you are feeling. We feel the same way. It's a completely unacceptable situation. They have been providing more information. They have provided information saying that those facilities have been taken offline and that they have a contractor who's been working to fix the issue. At this point, it does not seem like those illicit discharges are continuing. Seems like they've made the corrections to fix them at this point. And there's more information that we have requested and that is pending related to the incident, but they're still in the compliance period. So as soon as all of the rest of the information is submitted, I'll be glad to share with everyone what we get and what we find from the investigation. I will just make one additional comment of note. Because of the allegations of that this was something that had been known since at least 2012, there is also a criminal investigation ongoing related to that aspect of it as well, not just a Clean Water Act investigation.
So Wayne, real quick, you're saying that they have taken corrective action, so it's that problem is not continuing. So at this point, it's really about a remediation.
Correct. And it's not continuing. They provided some evidence to that effect, although in a letter that we sent today, we're requiring that they submit that evidence with a PE seal certifying that is the case. They have not yet done that. They've only provided testing results, not a certification.
Where do they get their water from for the building?
They get it from the city of Raleigh, and
turn it off.
That is a remedial action. No, seriously, and we have made them aware that while we do not have enforcement authority through the Clean Water Act, the city ordinance does allow us to discontinue service to buildings that are out of compliance and have been given due notification that they are out of compliance. I think it's a 20-day period. So that's something that's been raised, and we have the ability to do that, Glenn.
Yeah, because if you turn the water off, then they have no discharge.
Right.
Yes, Graham.
Yes, I understand that this particular discharge has been discontinued, but where does that leave the neighborhood? You know, are we looking at some health issue that there needs to be some sort of action taken? If it's nothing but notifying people that this has happened, and I mean official notification from the city, and not just the local newspaper, or perhaps that's already been done and I missed it.
If I may, Jonathan, I'll make a couple comments on that. We have done a few things. We have done television inspection of all of the pipes downstream of that building, our city stormwater pipes, and we have not seen anything unusual in those pipes that would be evidence of an illicit wastewater discharge. So those pipes look pretty much like every other stormwater pipe in the city, old, cracked, and broken, but no evidence of an illicit discharge. I do want to put into context, because the water quality sampling results were brought up, and if Kevin Boyer is still on, please correct me if I say anything wrong. We have one of our ongoing regular water quality monitoring sites that is in Walnut Creek. Now it's on the main stem of Walnut Creek, but it is downstream of the tributary that receives the flow from the Terry Sanford building. While those fecal counts are high, they are at or below the average fecal counts from that we see in pretty much every urban stream that we sample across the city of Raleigh. Fecal contamination is a problem throughout the city, not just in this single tributary. So, you know, from a public education standpoint, it's not safe for kids to have a lot of contact in urban streams. That's just a fact of living in the city. And Kevin, if you want to add any comment related to the water quality there.
Yes, we do monitor our streams, 18 locations around the city, which might sound like a large number, but for the size of a city, it's not real tight coverage. The closest one to this stream that receives the discharge from the Terry Sanford building is called Little Rock Creek, as many of you know, and it discharges into Walnut Creek there near the wetland center. And our closest monitoring point is not that close. It's about 6 miles downstream on Walnut Creek. So there's a lot of flow that comes into a lot of dilution, a lot of other contributing flow along the way before we get to one of our monitoring points.
Kevin, did I give an appropriate assessment? I know it was very general in terms of the water quality of that sampling site versus others.
It's comparable on the low side of comparable, I would say, and yes, E. coli, coliform pollution is just a chronic thing, and especially in urban settings, but and in rural settings as well for different reasons. It could be livestock in rural settings. In urban settings, it's sewer overflows, leaky sewers, dogs, dog waste, even waterfowl contribute to coliform pollution.
Gotcha. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Wayne. All right, guys. Any other comments? Yeah, Evan.
Just real quick, I want to touch back on the topic that Dale raised about the drainage assistance projects and seeing that mapped out against some social equity variables. I'd still be very interested in seeing that at our next meeting. And some of the other discussion today, I think, has highlighted a need to continue to look at the services provided through stormwater and making sure that they are accessible and known and accessed throughout the city. But just putting in a plug for hearing that item soon.
Yeah, is Dale still on here?
I am.
Yeah, Dale, is that something that we could get a look at in our August meeting, or do you think it will be later in the year for that?
I mean, I definitely think we can have sort of a first pass of what we're looking at in terms of that map, and then maybe if there's some points of refinement to further help, we can bring that back at future SMAC meetings.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. And Wayne, whenever that is ready, I think that's definitely something we'd like to see on the agenda.
Absolutely, be glad to.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks, guys. It was good to see everybody today. I move to adjourn the meeting. Do we have a second? All right. Mr. Taylor, all in favor? All right. We are adjourned. Thanks, everyone.